Hello, this is John Stanford, the host of the Making Medicine podcast. We're thrilled to have MacKay Jimeson, Executive Director of the Patient Access and Affordability Project at Patients Rising, with us today to talk about all things patients, all things drug development, and of course, all things policy. MacKay, so glad you could be here today. To start off, one of the things we hear most from listeners is they're so keen to hear where people came from and all the twisted and tortuous paths that led to a career in pharmaceutical or life science. And you've had a little bit of both. Can you talk a little bit about who you are and your history and how you ended up running the Patient Access and Affordability Project?
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate you having me on. I'm happy to talk a little bit about my background. I view it as chapters, but first, I just want to thank you for having me on. I find America's really at a crossroads when it comes to healthcare, and we need to have as many people as possible talking about this conversation. And I just say that because I didn't really start my career out in healthcare. I started out in politics like many others. My first chapter was working for the governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, initially as a spokesperson, as a speechwriter, and then later on wanted to have some business experience. I worked for some small companies, and then got back into politics for a little bit in the 2008 campaign. My candidate didn't win. I needed a job, and I happened to find one at Pfizer. And I was just really fortunate. Pfizer was looking for someone with different experience than the kind of traditional healthcare PR route. This was at the beginning of the Obamacare negotiations. And obviously the pharmaceutical industry has been under pretty heavy political attack for years. And so it was a kind of a right fit, right time. It really had a great run at Pfizer. That was the second chapter of my career. I initially was a spokesperson for the company, and then later became the corporate affairs lead for one of Pfizer's businesses, their internal medicine business. And it really gave me an incredible vantage point into all aspects of the organization. When I initially got into Pfizer, I focused a lot on sort of our late stage pipeline. And then as I progressed, I had more experience with some of the inline products. So I've covered everything from the earlier stage science into the regulatory issues, as well as once you get a medicine on market, what are sort of the implications with access, what are the implications with litigation in some cases, as well as what happens when drug loses exclusivity. I've also had the opportunity to see manufacturing plants. I've been in the labs where scientists work and discover drugs. I've also, as part of my job, traveled all over the world talking with health ministers or other officials, and I've had really diverse experience learning how other countries are really trying to solve their own healthcare crises. And so that kind of inspired the third leg of my career, which is I'm in now, is really understanding how important it is that we redesign our system to center around the patient first and foremost. I'm working now with an organization called Patients Rising. At the core of Patients Rising, it's really always been about helping people be their own best advocate in the healthcare system. We do a lot of work with a university-style program to help them become advocates, as well as we have a helpline that patients can call about really any need that they have. And we will help them get the resources or put them in touch with a network of other organizations that can provide them the services that they need. So that's the core of Patients Rising. And then kind of the bookends of that is we have an advocacy organization, our 501c4, called Patients Rising Now. And then what I lead is a little bit more of the policy arm. We like to call it our think tank arm, though that might be a bit grandiose, but it's the Patient Access and Affordability Project. And it really is what it says. It's about access, affordability, transparency, and equity. I always say our aim is to be the leading source of patient-inspired health policy. It's a job that I really have a personal passion towards and have really enjoyed We just brought together an advisory board to help guide us in terms of looking ahead on our kind of strategic plan for the future, both laying out a vision for what we want the Patient Access and Affordability Project to become, but also what's our vision for healthcare? What does America need as it relates to maintaining leadership in science and innovation, but also how do we think about financing healthcare to keep up with the pace of science and medical innovation that we see?
Well, and I think that's what we're going to spend so much of today's episode unpacking, because as we're going to talk about in a second, you made some very good and public points about you can't have it all to some extent. And so, I think that's a fascinating sort of background you had from politics into healthcare, then just this deep expertise that develops because, Pfizer, if you talk about sort of someone with a big enough footprint that you would be seeing health ministers, but also seeing labs, but also seeing manufacturing, a little bit of exposure to everything. And I think that gives you a really good lens for what you're trying to do now. And I think where Incubate and Patients Rising definitely overlap is this idea of patient-centricity. And I think in a nutshell, from Incubate's perspective, patient-centricity is going to require choice. And if we make some decisions, if we go down some paths that are being discussed that limit innovation, the other way I think about it is, okay, you're giving patients fewer choices. So one of our VCs always puts it to me, well, hip replacement is a terribly painful surgery and enormously expensive. But if you need it, you go get it. In 10 years from now, we should be taking some sort of pill that alleviates that. And maybe we have no hip replacements because medicine is doing the job that the surgery has been doing. And when I think about patient centricity, you can't have the patient at the center if there are no choices. So I don't care how cheap we make hip replacements, you're still going to have to go to the hospital. You're still going to have your hip replaced. And I think sometimes people don't think about innovation as a patient choice aspect. They think about it from the science perspective or the cost perspective. But, I wonder if you have any reaction to that. Is to some extent empowering the patient going to require more choices for the patient about how they want to address their particular therapeutic need?
Choices, transparency, access to information, I think are all going to be critical elements. One of the things that really frustrates me, I hear all the time that things are too sophisticated for patients, or patients don't have an interest in X, Y, and Z. My experience is the complete opposite. Now, you may have varying degrees of sophistication based off of a patient maybe just being diagnosed versus, a patient who's been dealing with a disease for a very long time. But my experience is there's a hunger for patients to understand what's going on in the healthcare system. They want to be actively engaged. They know they have to be their self-advocate, especially now. We're seeing the erosion of the patient-doctor relationship. And the power being now put in the hands of really large companies or the government to decide what's best for them. The interesting thing on the hip replacement thing is when it comes to cost, a lot of times you're not even seeing real competition as it relates to those procedures. And I'm aware of a startup that's doing some really great work in almost doing an Expedia style or an Airbnb style model where you can do procedures. You can ask the hospital systems to compete for procedures. This business is getting procedures done at a lower cost than the rebated rates that the insurers are getting. That's an example of where I think you have entrepreneurs, where you have investors behind really innovative solutions. But the reason nobody's heard of this company is because it's a threat to the health systems. It's a threat to the consolidated powers that kind of exist. And so that's one of the biggest things that I think we really have to tackle is to make meaningful change in the healthcare system, to provide the type of choice to center things around patients is going to take, I think, a unwinding of a very entangled system of self-interest of some very large organizations.
Yeah, I think I feel like the discussion of that unwinding is fodder for dozens more episodes, because
Yeah.
I think you're exact. I think it bears saying that our system right now is not patient-centered.
100%. I would even say it was never designed to be patient centric, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we really have is we can't go back in time. We can only go forward, but to go forward is going to probably require some difficult choices that counter, some longstanding business interests. And, when you think about really our modern healthcare or modern health insurance system, it was really built around the 1940s, in response to inflation at that point in time in wage controls. And, what happened was, rather than offering increased wages, employers started to offer health insurance as a way to compete for employees, which then set off Blue Cross and Blue Shield to design products catered to employers and later the government. And really, when you think about it, the product has always been the payer. It's always been the employer or the government. The product's never been centered towards the actual patient itself. And so we have to unravel almost 100 years of a system that's been built up, but it was never centered around the patient to begin with.
Yeah, and I think that's something we all should dwell on for a second, that the patient has never been at the center of our healthcare system. And so I think that's why a lot of the work that you do is so important. And I also completely agree about this, the way we talk about patients and we talk about their literacy rates as it relates to a therapeutic area. I don't think you can see a better informed group than a set of patients or parents of patients poring over NIH studies and anxiously awaiting phase 2 and phase 3A and B results. So I think this idea that patients can't follow what's going on in healthcare is completely contradictory, because it's in your self-interest to understand your disease and the options that are out there, but it is so hard. And Kirsten Axelson, who I know has been on talking about clinical trial access and making that more available. And I think that's another component to allow people to know if clinical trials can have a place in their particular therapy.
Yeah.
So we have
we
have one.
Sorry,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, actually, I do think clinical trials, that's another area where I'm seeing a lot of investment as well as a lot of entrepreneurial thinking. I'm, a company that I'm familiar with as well has really rethought even how you do patient recruitment, rather than, everything's always been these big advertising campaigns, bus ads and whatever else. And it's never really been particularly effective. This particular company's changed it where they're integrated into health systems EMRs, and they're able to identify qualified patients and use their actual treating physician as someone who can offer them a clinical trial as a treatment option, which makes a ton of sense. And so rather than having to revolve around academic medical centers, we're actually touching patients at the actual point of care. And their success rate in terms of recruiting patients that are actually qualified, meaning they meet the criteria set forth in the clinical trials, is astronomical. It's a game changer.
Yeah, I think the democratization of clinical trials is it's kind of you have two sides who need to find each other, and we had just designed a system that didn't let them find each other. But of course, the simplest thing to do is go get that trusted guidance from the doctor. So I'm sure the startups in these spaces are going to see some breakthroughs. I want to pivot to the original reason for having you on, because for many of our listeners, we got a lot of policymakers and their staffs who listen. You wrote a pretty compelling piece, in my view, in Stat following the State of the Union, and it put voice to something that was really on my mind that night as well. And for those of you who haven't seen it, we'll make sure we attach it in the podcast notes. But it's a great article, and it looks at two sentences in the State of the Union. The first one being President Biden's announcement that at long last, he and Democrats in Congress have reined in drug prices through the Inflation Reduction Act. And we've talked a lot on this show about the impact of price controls on investment. But then 40 minutes later in the speech, he talks about that under the Biden administration, they're launching a moonshot that's going to tackle cancer. And you wrote a piece saying these two sentences are fundamentally at odds, and that they were spaced out in the speech so that you forgot that one was said related to the other. Can you just talk a little bit more about your thinking that you opined and in that op-ed that I just thought was great?
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is something that's really been of a concern to me ever since President Biden was elected, because he's talked quite a bit, even during the campaign, about looking to more of a European style system for managing, healthcare expenses. And, the Inflation Reduction Act has really been a significant step in that direction. And I should just say, just by background, I lived in Europe as well as Canada in my childhood. My mom, when I was in college at this point, had a disease. She's okay now, but while they were living in Europe and had to move back to the States, I know a lot of people love how Europe operates healthcare. I've had my experiences with it. My family's had more experiences. We've moved back to the States and live here for a reason. But all that said, we're at a place where we have, I think, very contradictory notions about the state of healthcare. In one, there's a desire to rein in cost. And I think that, I think that's not a wrong desire. Right? We shouldn't have wasteful spending. But there's definitely this politicization of healthcare, and particularly the pharmaceutical industry. When you look at it, and it's a declining spend year over year. Now, it is a significant spend, but we're ignoring roughly 92% of the overall costs in the healthcare system. But this idea that on one end, we can have a moonshot to address cancer, and then on the other end, be saying that if you are successful at developing new treatments, we're going to take away the original incentive that existed. Those two policies are incompatible, right? And so it's a concern that I think, listen, State of the Unions, there's some poll-tested rhetoric without a doubt.
You're a speechwriter. You know how this goes.
Yeah, but we're going a little bit beyond the rhetoric, I think, with the policy that we're seeing. And now that we see what CMS is doing as it relates to both the Inflation Reduction Act, but also as it relates to how they're starting to look at accelerated approval drugs, not just in Alzheimer's, by the way, expanding beyond to look at cell and gene therapy, immunology, other areas where there's tremendous promise in science. We're moving to an area where we have an incredibly contradictory approach even within our own government. I actually wrote a piece recently called that we have a Cold War within HHS, where you have the FDA, and I've been very critical of the FDA historically, but I will say I think they're moving in the right direction in many ways in trying to accelerate new medicines to patients where there's just a substantial need. And listen, there may be some controversial decisions that are made along the way, but I think as long as we're being evidence-based, we're developing evidence over time, the right answer will come forward, and we'll understand that. And trust me, these patients are desperate for medicines. We shouldn't hold them back from them. But then on the other end, you have the payer side of the system that says, we're distrusting of that FDA's approval. We don't know how to deal with this what they deem a low level of evidence. And so they're moving towards this path of choosing not to cover these medicines for these patients. this is, particularly when you look at a disease area like Alzheimer's, which disproportionately touches seniors, this is Medicare saying to the population that they serve, we're not looking out for your interests. To me, that is frightening. That is frightening.
Yeah, I think, and if you put Incubate's hat on of being the investor, it's frightening too, because our investments are 10 years out, 15 years out. The dollars we invest today hopefully bring forward a medicine in 10 years. So if we show that only works if we know that in 2033, the reimbursement system in the United States looks something like it looked like in 2023. And we're starting to see more coverage and more discussion. But I'm with you. We've got the bucket of problems that the Inflation Reduction Act caused. We've got the small molecule penalty. We haven't really solved, and I want to come back to this, we haven't really solved access and affordability issues. No. We just made ourselves feel better for a second. There are some good pro-patient reforms. We like patient smoothing. We like capping out-of-pocket costs. These are things Incubate fights for. But we've also got over here, which you've just touched on, and this idea that FDA approval is no longer the stamp that it used to be on a product, and payers are second guessing. In this case, CMS. That's a dangerous, dangerous place to be. And at first it was, it's just Alzheimer's because of the data and because it's going to be so expensive. These tools, and this as a product of not just policy, but politics, once you create a tool in the toolkit, you don't put it away. No. You keep finding other reasons to use that tool. And these non-coverage decisions seem to now be CMS's tool to say, well, you convinced the FDA, but we're not convinced. And that's a bifurcated system that patients can't afford.
And it's not scientific, it's ideological. There's this piece that was actually published in one of the medical journals yesterday from some of the folks at Harvard. And they cherry-picked 3 countries. They looked at France, Germany, and Canada, and they decided that basically nearly all of the medicines, that the top medicines in Medicare basically should not be prescribed to patients because they're not significant enough in their value. Now, none of those countries ask the patient how valuable those medicines are to them, but that's the system that people are envisioning. They want to put the power in the hands of health economists to determine whether or not something is of value to the system. And they're looking at it, again, from the payer perspective, from the health system's perspective, which means that they're not, if you have a medicine that helps you go back to work, increases your productivity, and this is where it really gets crazy. That's actually in the employer's interest, right? But the health insurers, the way that they're designing their benefits programs, they're not capturing productivity as a benefit to them. And so even though it's even in the employer's interest, it's not going to necessarily be reflected in how the insurance design covers it, because fundamentally they're focused on costs in the existing system that they're captured, not indirect medical costs, not things related to economic benefit, being able to continue in education, be able to take care of your children, for example, all sorts of societal benefits that are of extreme value. It could be as simple as not even going back to work. But, I heard a story of a medicine in a rare disease space where one of the things that was learned through the clinical trial process was just for that medicine to give a patient the ability to move their finger so that they could operate a wheelchair was a game changer for them. Now, from a health economist perspective, that may not be substantial value, but to that patient, it's a game changer. It's a game changer. And so the biggest concern to me is when all these CMS policies are made, who's asking the patient what they think, right? Instead, it's just using some algorithms to model out some kind of cost-benefit analysis rather than understanding the true human impact associated with a particular medicine.
Well, and I think even some supporters of the Inflation Reduction Act, we said, look, the devil's going to be in the details here. It's one thing to say, okay, we're ushering in an era of price controls. Okay, how are you going to set the price? In this initial CMS guidance, Incubate filed some comments on, but a lot of the patient community and Congress, by some extent, have now started talking about QALYs, these adjusted life years. And even some of the most ardent supporters of the Inflation Reduction Act are saying, no, we're not for QALYs. But okay, it gets to your word sort of incompatible policies. Okay, well, at some point, you're letting a health economist or someone at CMS begin to be determining value without the patient voice. And I know the patient community has been very concerned about not having a seat at the table as these price controls are developed. Is that something Patient Rising or your project at Access and Affordability Project have been looking at?
Yeah, in fact, we've been tip of the spear as it relates to really calling into question the use of the QALY, really questioning ICER's methodology. We do believe it's inherently discriminatory. It is an outdated method. It was designed before I was born. I try to assume best intent, and I'm assuming that it was probably fit for purpose in the 1960s and 70s, but in the 21st century, it's completely outdated. But this is part of sort of this ideological, system that there are people believe that this is the standard that we have. This is good enough. And the funny thing is, it's the same people that are saying that the medicines that are being approved today are not innovative enough, that are unwilling to say that how they're measuring value needs to be adjusted because times have changed, right? And I'm like, it's a bit of a double standard, folks. Like the reality is, we should expect medicines to improve and increase value to patients over time. That's a legitimate expectation, and manufacturers should be expected to demonstrate that evidence as well. And every manufacturer I speak to say, we're happy to try to show the evidence. But then you have these health economists that are like, well, we've been using the QALY for 40 years. It's the gold standard. We don't need to change it. It's the gold standard. No, medicine has evolved. Science has evolved. We're now in the state where we can capture things in an incredibly more granular way using technology. And there's this complete unwillingness to move away from it. Fortunately, you're right. Members of Congress many are deeply concerned about the use of QALY. There's a reason why it was banned as it relates to making access decisions for Medicare. And it does seem like we're moving in the direction like it will not be used for negotiations. That said, there's also other measures that are not great that other European governments use that I do think that we should be keeping an eye on as well. It's hard to call out which one because we don't know what CMS is looking at right now. But I think the bigger point is that there needs to be more of an effort at encouraging academics, economists, the private sector, et cetera, to be thinking about what is the right way to be valuing new health technologies? What is the best process? There shouldn't be a monopoly on. ICER should not be a monopoly on health technology assessment. The federal government should not be a monopoly on health technology assessment. We should encourage people who probably don't reside in Washington, D.C. to start putting forward 100 different ideas, because 100 different ideas will yield 100 different results, and we will start to have a dialogue on what is the best way to value it. I personally, I'm not going to be able to do it. You probably can't do it, but collectively we can at least we can have a competition of ideas and discussion rather than just saying, no, it's the status quo or some augmented version of that.
Well, what I think you're spot on there, and I think everyone heard it here first. An open call for HTA ideas that actually take into account the modern lifestyle. I remember years ago, one of the rheumatoid arthritis products was going from an injectable to an oral, going from an infusion therapy to an oral pill. And a lot of people said, well, that's not that innovative. Well, tell that to the patient. Tell that to the patient who's comfortable taking a pill at work, but not comfortable doing infusion, or just the ease of not going to the clinic. So I think I think what is innovation, leaving the patient's voice out and turning this into a philosophical economics argument at a college campus really leaves out all of us, because we're all going to be patients someday. We all want to walk more. We want to be healthier. What else? I'll close with here. I'm so grateful for the time you spent with us today. What can Incubate's listeners expect out of your project and Patient Rising in the months and years to come?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So for 2023, we're really focused on a handful of areas. We're actually we did some really important work last year as it relates to health technology assessment for rare disease therapies. We're going to build off of that this year. And I actually think it's more relevant than I ever expected because of the issues with accelerated approval. Based off of the debate that we're seeing, there needs to be stronger guidance on how to collect evidence over time to demonstrate value as it relates to these accelerated approval drugs. We can't just say you can't have them because they haven't received full approval. It's just fundamentally wrong and unethical. So that's a major area of focus for us. Another area that we're going to be focusing on as well is there's still a lot of issues as it relates to PBMs, formulary designs, both in the branded space with things like copay accumulators and maximizers, which are just basically just killing patients as it relates to out-of-pocket costs, but also it's killing our generics and biosimilars markets as it relates to competition. We need effective and competitive biosimilars markets to drive down lower costs, and people will be surprised that the PBMs and the GPOs are actually standing in the way of competition. And then another area that we're going to continue to focus on is, I think, really, I call it patient transparency, but it's really focused on the lack of transparency within the healthcare system that patients deserve to have a better right to know on. We're currently working on a strategic planning process as well as we go forward in 2024 and beyond. I think we're looking to be more provocative and more disruptive. The biggest question on my mind that we want to dig into is really the question around healthcare finance. How we did it in the mid 20th century is not how we need to be doing it in the 21st century. And so how do we how do we move the way that we finance healthcare in a way that reflects advances in science and medicine? Number one. Number two, we'll continue to have like a keen eye on rare disease, particularly ultra rare disease. But also the reality is neurodegenerative diseases and obesity-related metabolic diseases are the epidemics of our generation. We need to get a handle on how we are going to address that all across the health system. And that's going to involve innovators in science and medicine. That's going to involve financing, how we finance it. But that's also going to deal with care. And thinking about that in an optimal way that enhances human life, but also make sure that we're able to afford these things as well. It's an incredibly expensive area. And then the third area that I'm really excited about is really looking at the application of digital health, looking at everything from patient privacy, who should own patient data. I'm actually going to argue it should be the patient, and we have the ability to do this through blockchain as opposed to third parties, as well as the role of AI in decision making. This is an area that's really of concern to me, particularly as you see this consolidation of power among, like CVS is a great example. How's the AI going to be used, but also the positives of digital? How can they enhance life? How can they improve drug development? How can they improve the way that we care for patients along the way? So those are three ambitious areas, but that's what we're really excited to be digging into going forward.
That is a full agenda, but I also love where I think we're going to have you back on, because a whole nother episode of how will ChatGPT change the patient experience. So I'm going to give you the homework of solving that question.
Yeah.
But that's a full agenda. And you can keep up with MacKay's work by following the Patient Access and Affordability Project at Patients Rising, where he is executive director. He is MacKay Jimeson. We're so grateful that you were able to join the conversation for one of our more patient-forward episodes, which I've really appreciated. So thank you again for joining. I am John Stanford. You can find the Making Medicine podcast, and so much more at incubatecoalition.org. Many thanks to Ashlyn Roberts and Grace Muster in production of today's episode. And as always, keep innovating.